So our next speaker is Andy Wyckoff, who is for the last 2 months a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a visiting senior fellow at the European University Institute. Prior to that, he was the director of OECD's Directorate for Science, Technology and Innovation for more than a decade, and also my boss for about 6 years. Before joining the OECD, he worked at the US Congressional Office of Technology Assessment and the National Science Foundation. And his keynote is titled Navigating the Way Forward on International AI Governance.
Good morning, and thank you, Alan, Stephen. I really appreciate the invitation. As Alan has just alluded to, this is my first public speaking event since becoming a free man a bit, not beholden to any one institution. So I certainly don't speak on behalf of EUI or Brookings this morning. But, you know, I was at the OECD a long time. You can Google this one or whatever search engine you like. And that gave me the great opportunity to sit at many different tables discussing tech governance around the world. Not only the OECD table, but the G7, the G20, well, too many UN meetings, and GPI, Global Partnership on AI. And so I'd like to take that and put a bit of a policy spin on what Philippe's been talking about this morning and share my thoughts about where we're going in terms of governance of this important technology. So, wow, as Alan said, we're at a critical moment. I've got kind of a long view. I've been doing this since '95. And it's clear we're at a point where we need to come together to work on a policy framework for AI. And we need to do it reasonably quickly. I think we dropped the ball between 2003 and 2005. And I think back, it was after the dot-com bust. There was a lot of consolidation in what were the big players. What emerged were a few really dominant players. We didn't really pay attention to this. The iPhone came, that then changed it again. And it would have been a point for policy intervention, but it didn't happen. And now we're playing really a catch-up game with many of the issues that have arisen. I don't want to see us repeat that mistake. Now, Philippe showed this, probably everyone today will show this. It is amazing how quickly generative AI, but it allows us, it provides a wake-up call for the policy community, which I really welcome. And you'll see why I welcome that in a second. And I think as Philippe has said far better than I ever can, it was the simple prompt interface combined with incredibly powerful model that has led its diffusion just to go viral and globally. Again, I hate to sound like an old man, but it reminds me of Netscape, the first commercial browser, which really opened up the World Wide Web to the general public. And if it wasn't for that, we probably wouldn't have generative AI today, because it led to this proliferation of different websites and data and so forth. Now, it's been viral diffusion. I think right now almost 10 million users around the globe. And what I find interesting is only about 12% of those are from the United States. I guess I would have expected more, but this really means it's global. And hence, the policy issue here really has to be a global one as well. But what I find interesting about this, and Philippe can keep me honest here, is we begin to see a slacking of the pickup on ChatGPT. But what I find more interesting is the black bar, the people who are using it on a regular basis. And this proves his point. It is an incredibly useful tool for everyday work for even people like me who aren't very technically proficient. And so it's far more than a blip. This is going to be ongoing, I think. And as he pointed to, the AI co-pilot study, which I find fascinating. And I started off as a productivity guy. And so, okay, 56% improvement in coding, that may be a little bit high, but even if you cut it in half, that's an amazing productivity gain. And if we begin to see that in other areas, it gives a taste of just how powerful and transformative this technology might be. But again, it underscores the point, now is the time to get a policy framework around this technology. Now, as I said, I sat around these tables. This is a lot easier said than done. It's really hard to get these countries to move in a similar direction. It's what in policy dialogue you would call a wicked policy problem. Right up there with climate change, as the Economist cartoon showed a second ago. So let me describe why I think it's such a wicked policy problem. First, as Philippe said again, the innovation around this area is just amazing. And if you look at the right-hand side of this figure, which if you think of Hinton et al.'s seminal paper in 2012, you've just seen this proliferation of different models and innovation in this area. So if you're a policy guy, it's like trying to hit a moving target, which is very hard to do because policy by necessity moves at a much slower pace. It has to be consultative. It has to be multi-stakeholder. You have to iterate and go back and forth, and that takes time. But we want that type of process. But with it, as Philippe has said, and if I understand him, we don't really completely understand how ChatGPT-4 works. It's been this morphing from what used to be vertical siloed models to more of a horizontal model, which I think was a little bit unexpected. And again, this makes policy making in this area very hard to do. And probably the next speaker who might refer to this, you just look at the ping pong match that's going on in Brussels and Strasbourg and other places. It's really hard to come to a real good policy framework. So another part of the wicked problem is the extreme concentration in a couple countries. This figure just shows compute by GDP, but it's clear we're really talking about two countries that are at the forefront of this technology, and it's the United States and China. Now, it's not only about compute, there are other parts of the AI value chain, but those parts are concentrated too, whether you're talking about machine tools coming from the Netherlands or chips coming from UK, Chinese Taipei, US, it's all very concentrated. Likewise, with VC AI investment and hence startups and new firms coming into the marketplace. Again, very concentrated in the United States and China, with UK being the fourth most active by the OECD data, which of course we put a lot of faith in. Yeah. Now, this asymmetry between countries means that compromise is very hard to find politically. These countries have vastly different incentives. The US has the incentive to preserve its leadership via innovation. The EU is rightfully worried about some of its existing sectors that are the bedrock of the EU economy, such as autos, finance, insurance. And then there's the rest of the world, which doesn't get talked about enough, which simply wants some agency, some input to be involved in the decision-making process and not automatically accept what's largely a Western perspective so far. The third problem is, and this one I don't know how to get around really, is this isn't publicly funded tech. This is privately funded tech. Many of us have seen the movie over the summer, Oppenheimer. That was publicly funded technology, and it meant getting a harness on it was far easier. When it's privately funded, and the big five now in the US have more R&D going on than all of US government budgeted R&D, which is Department of Defense, gigantic, National Institutes of Health, gigantic, but it's more than all of Germany's R&D, whether public or private. I don't know if everyone fully appreciates the scale of the size of these companies and their ability to innovate. And again, this changes the nature of the problem from previous technologies. And then there's the risks, and you've heard about them, and they're what we call asymmetrical. Incredible possible breakthroughs, and we begin to see it in protein folding, in creativity, in productivity, but also with it is a real dual use nature of a lot of these technologies for really not good things. So you want a new drug, we might be able to find it. You want a new bioweapon, it might be used that way too. You want creativity, you might also get deep fakes, which could erode democratic processes, so forth and so on. And again, this creates a real difficult problem for policymakers. Okay, last but not least, I don't need to dwell on this. Wow, we've seen a return of the Cold War with a containment strategy and a very hot war not so far from here. Now, these are rapidly shifting geopolitics, which again make a global solution very difficult. Just look at some of the dynamics going on with the G20 this week. Now, it's no wonder many very smart people think it's time for some new regulation and new institutions. And over the summer, two really interesting papers came out. And oddly enough, the authors both have a connection to DeepMind, Google. One is the paper came out in July by Bremer and Sullivan. It's getting a lot of attention. Every day I read an article about it, New York Times, Guardian, and it's a big book. It's going to come from them soon. And the second is by Ho et al., which again are from DeepMind. They're written independently, but they come to very similar conclusions or proposals. So let me briefly outline these. So the first is the need, proposals for a governance framework around AI. The first is we need an objective scientific fact-finding body to give us the state of art on AI. And here, many people point to the IPCC as an antecedent, an existing organization. And I hope speaking in Geneva, all these organizations are very familiar to you. The second is we need somebody to set guardrails and control proliferation and verify particular choke points in the value chain. And here, the IAEA is frequently invoked as a model. Ho then talks about the need for giving access to those that can't afford a lot of compute, and they refer to something not too far from here you're familiar with. And last but not least is, okay, what do you do when an accident or a dangerous situation has occurred? And this, at least the Bremer and Sullivan talked to the Financial Stability Board as an antecedent, a precedent that might be able to deal with this. Now, listen, these are great ideas. And I'm a policy optimist. And so I say, yeah, go for it. I too would love world peace and have everyone getting along. But there's the pragmatic realist part of me too that says, okay, let's go for that. We shouldn't ever stop that as a goal. But that's going to take some time. This is moving so fast. How do we rectify the two? And do we need a plan B? At least an interim plan B until plan A works out. So let me pitch you my plan B. My plan B is, I grew up in Vermont, is a snowball approach. You start small with this small group of countries that maybe control a lot of those choke points that Sullivan's talking about. And then you roll and you try to get more countries coming in until you get a critical mass. How am I doing? And I'm going to make a proposal here, which a lot of you are not going to like, but that's okay. That's why we have a discussion period. And I'm going to say the least worst solution at the moment is the group of 7 countries, the G7, which include a lot of observers. Now, let me explain to you why I think that is the way we need to go, at least for the interim. First of all, I don't think the G7's work in this area is very visible or appreciated. That's maybe because it's a small group of countries. But few people realize they started studying this problem in 2016, when Japan invoked the first ministerial meeting under their presidency on this issue. And at that meeting, they produced these AI R&D ethical guidelines. They tabled them. Not the countries didn't necessarily agree to them, but it was a start, and it started minds thinking. And again, this isn't well recognized, maybe because the Japanese are very humble and modest people. But that was the beginning. They then went on to fund the OECD. And they funded the OECD for a large conference in 2017, a book in 2018. In 2018, the OECD started to form an AI experts group whose mandate was to come up with principles for AI, non-binding, voluntary principles, which the OECD did in 2019. And when you think about it, for an organization working across 34 member countries, that's fast. They approved it in May of 2019 at OECD's annual ministerial, along with 6 other countries, or 8 other countries that came in, including Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Singapore, and Egypt, making 44 countries. The next month, those principles went to the G20, again under the Japanese presidency. In June of 2019, the G20 adopted their AI principles, which are word for word the same as the OECD principles. The OECD's name doesn't appear on it for good political reasons. That brought the number of adherents up to 50. That's what I mean by snowball. Starting small, rolling, and then getting a critical mass. Now, the G7 hasn't stopped. Alan's job is the Global Partnership on AI. This was thanks to the Canadian presidency of the G7 in 2018, followed by the French presidency in 2019. And the idea was to take those principles, which are great, but they're principles, and move to practice. What does practical implementation of these principles look like? And that's GPI's mandate. Launched in 2020, it had 15 founding members, including India, the EU, and Singapore. It's now 25, I thought, Alan, with Argentina, Brazil, Senegal, and Turkey. 29. Okay, I'm even behind. So GPI's up and running. Now, I think it needs a few tweaks, which I'll talk about at the very end. And then in 2021, under the UK G7 presidency, they launched something called the Future Technology Forum in London, which the idea here was to get upstream on these technologies, more anticipatory technology governance. Let's just not wait to be confronted with it. Let's get into the labs more. And the idea here was to go beyond digital or AI to include quantum computing, synthetic biotechnology, and so forth. And last year, well, this June and December, they formed a global forum on technology at the OECD, whose job is to exactly look into these more future technologies. Now, in 2021 as well, the TTC was created, which creates really strong working level links between the US and the EU, which to me is a very positive sign. And then in 2023, we're back to the G7, again under the Japanese presidency, and we have something called the Hiroshima process. In May, leaders of the G7 countries came to Hiroshima, started this process. It's underway right now. Matter of fact, ministers just met last week and came up with a declaration mandating that by the end of the year, we come up with a code of conduct for generative AI. And again, probably won't be binding, but it forces these 7 countries and a lot of the observers and the EU for that matter to adhere to a common approach, which I think is a very useful thing. Let me just end by presenting my plan B, which is great. Let's go for plan A. We really should. I'm a firm believer in the need for better institutionalization, but that's going to take time, particularly in the current environment. So my plan B is to use some of the existing entities that we have to begin to move in that direction and maybe become the antecedents for what may follow. Let me just end with a concluding slide. In the interest of time, I'll just give you a few of the big ideas. The pro side of this is speed, immediately. Beginning to engage right now. Things are up and running and work can start. The con is the big elephant isn't in the room even, and that's China. And how do we engage China, where we have to, given their dominant role in doing AI? Lastly, a lot of these institutions I just showed on my plan B need to be changed. UNESCO doesn't really have this technical capability yet. Maybe they need to partner with the ITU. GPI needs to change its mandate and its orientation to really be like the FSB. It isn't at the moment, but their terms of reference are being reviewed right now, so it's a good time to think about this. Let me end by thanking you for your attention. I welcome any comments or questions.
Thank you very much, Andy. And so first question from the audience says, how willing are tech companies to help policymakers to develop policies instead of just lobbying for their products?
Well, that's a great question. Probably not best to put to me. I actually think there's a growing interest. I think they want some of the regulation because they don't want to risk the reputational damage possibly of something going wrong. And they'd rather be able to point to a government framework that gives them some cover and more of a predictable policy environment in which for them to operate. So I think there's a lot of willingness there. The question is, the track history on voluntary codes and voluntary agreements isn't great. I do think we need to couple that with really hard regulations to make it really work.
Okay, second question I have here says, very interesting in your snowball approach. Surely the big world economies will run away and run the agenda, leaving behind small development states who are already struggling with connectivity.
Yeah, that's a con without question. And so I think I welcome ideas on how to fix that. I do think some of these entities, and we've seen it even at the OECD on their work on taxes, has opened up to basically a global engagement. So it's possible. Also, what I didn't show here, but there's this global policy.ai framework that already exists as well that involves UN, the World Bank, the IDB, and others. And maybe using those partners, we can bring in some of those less represented countries.
Great. We have a question from the audience here.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. Maybe just a quick question regarding the funding and the ability of the big companies to advance on R&D and to create products. Especially, I'm working on a startup, and I'm involved with the EIC, EIT, and I don't know if all of us were familiar here with the technological readiness level in the EU, but most of the time we are very good in R&D, and then the valley of death, and we are not able to publish, I mean, not to publish, but to put anything to the market. So yeah, it's a big issue because for, let's say, people willing to get fundings, in the end, it's far more easier to go and to talk with the big players than with the institution, because we are losing a lot of time. And maybe a second question, because I fully agree with the snowball approach, and it's linked as well to the ISO norms. Actually, a few years ago, the MIT published a book regarding how ISO norms, even in the mid and after the Cold War, for instance, in the US and the USSR, thanks to the ISO norms, actually, a nail in both countries were exactly the same. So it's exactly the same kind of approach that we need to follow. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, I about the valley of death. Yeah, I feel for you. And again, this isn't my métier really, but we see the same dynamic. It's too bad it's happened in digital. It didn't used to be that way. It was a lot more independence. But we see the same thing in the pharmaceutical sector. You see a lot of innovation around individual molecules by startups and so forth that then almost have to sell to the big pharma for the regulatory processes, the production, the marketing, and so forth. Now, that model seems to become the norm and accepted. And there's a question whether or not that's the case that will go on with AI. I hope not. I do think some of the tools out there, the growing open source movement, the ability to use cloud to get compute may stop that from happening, but you know far better than I would.
Other questions from the audience?
Yes, thank you for the presentation. Recently was published an index on Latin America about the state of art and practice on AI, and it shows that the influence of China and Russia principally has risen at the same time that the US and the European Union has become lesser important in R&D collaboration. Considering that and this framework that you showed, don't you think it's a risk that China and Russia are increasingly supporting more Latin America specifically, and they are on the other side being left at the side of this conversation? So they can like attract Latin American countries and because they are investing more.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. But a lot of Latin America is a member of the OECD. And quite a few are member of the G20. So you've got Argentina and Brazil coming in. You've already got Colombia, Chile, Peru's a candidate country as well. And so I'm hopeful they're at least conflicted a bit. But as for the R&D, you know, I want to think about that a little bit. To some extent, I think competition's a good thing. And so maybe this will bring the US and other players, UK, France, Germany, more to have competition to give really Latin America the funding that they need, because there's a lot of skills down there. And so, yeah, I guess I'm a bit split on that, but yours isn't the only area. You see competition just this week. The US announced their version of a Belt and Road. There's competition on investment to lure countries into various spheres going on in many different domains.
Okay, I know we have another question here, but I also have another question online, and I know that you will love this question, so I want to ask this.
Yeah.
Before even establishing the code of conduct, how close are we to a common definition of AI, at least the kind that needs regulating?
Yeah, that's a good question. Better put to one of our colleagues. So the OECD, I think what we're best at, I like the policy, but it's the data, it's the definition, it's the methodology, it's kind of, can we get some rigor and evidence below some of these things and get rid of the hype and some of the politics. And so a definition was developed early on. It was the one we've been using. It's the one the EU points to and others, but it's clear it needs to be, this can't just be done once and left. It needs to be evaluated and updated and so forth. What I far prefer, and hasn't gotten that much attention, is the classification scheme that the OECD with its partners, it's never the OECD, has developed that is much more variegated and I think nuanced. And we have to stop thinking of AI as one monolithic thing. Like, we don't have food policy. We have dairy, fish, grains, fruit. I mean, we have different policies for different types of food. We need that for AI as well. You're not going to have one approach. So I think the definition then becomes hard. And that's why I like the more of a taxonomy approach, which is what the OECD classification moves towards. But again, it needs to be constantly updated, particularly for generative AI. And I think that's happening as we speak.
Okay, one last question because we're eating on our coffee break here.
Oh.
Sorry about that. I'm an ETH engineer from the Baggers University Hospital in Zurich. This is not really my topic, but actually we work a lot with data. So it's important to have regulation. I did an internship in Shanghai for 3 months. And I did it 5 years ago. They were really innovative and very good with technology and AI. Then I'm sure they are even better than US now, I will suggest. And are there plans to bring China together? Because as you pointed out, it's not on the table, and I think they should.
So 2 quick thoughts. Again, I'm a policy guy, not a tech guy. We just Philippe. But it looks like generative AI was a bit of a surprise to China. And they may not be in the same position on that type of AI than they were in others. And some of their recent policy decisions around data and their tech companies won't help them catch up on generative AI, which takes a lot of data. So there's a question mark there. But without question, I think they need to be engaged. Now, you might have to wait for the US election to see a thawing. You're beginning to see hints of it now. The other thing is, I'm just reading tea leaves here. The UK will have a AI safety summit in November, early November. And they've caused a little bit of controversy because they want to invite China, which again, I think is a positive thing. And I could speak on my own personal. If I was at the OECD, I'd give you a lot more waffle words. Because some of the members of the OECD are not in favor of that invitation.
Okay. Coffee. I think we can thank Andy again, and then we have our coffee break.